everybody, and thank you for joining us today. So we are going to be talking about ice damming, which coincidentally is the perfect time because in the last 2 weeks with all of the winter weather that we've been receiving, we've been seeing a lot of these issues with the icicle buildup throughout the GTA. So we're going to be taking a look at what ice damming is and why it can be such a major problem, not just for your building, but as a property manager yourself. We're going to be taking a look at how it happens and why it forms, what you can do to address it, as well as some possibilities for how we can help you out. At the end of the presentation, we are going to be doing an open forum Q&A. One of our senior estimators from BC, Duncan Campbell, is going to be joining us for that portion. Not only is Duncan an expert when it comes to this issue, but it's something he's also very passionate about. So he will be able to answer any questions that you may have. If there are any questions that arise throughout the presentation, please feel free to pose them in the chat and we will get around to them at the end. Also, at the end of the presentation, we will be doing a gift card draw for anybody that is around till the very end, or a $100 Amazon gift card. So what is ice damming? Ice damming is snow that melts and refreezes along the edge of a roof surface, and ultimately it's actually a result of heat loss. So it can form in many ways, but at its scariest and most critical, it can look a little something like this. So why is this such a problem? For starters, the presence of ice damming can actually indicate much larger issues that are occurring inside a home. One of the most obvious ways that it can be an issue is that it can be a liability because of the dangers of the falling icicles once it starts to warm up and they melt and break off. Some of the issues that can occur also include exterior damages. So the heavy weight on the eaves trough can damage and pull that down entirely. It can also cause damages to your shingles, soffits, and fascia. The issues can also result in interior water ingress or condensation and any associated damages that come along with that. With the leaks or condensation, that also might present some attic mold growth, which of course is a health and safety concern that you would want to get addressed as soon as possible. Again, because it's a heat loss issue, this can also result in higher energy bills for your residents. So a simplified version of how this happens. First, you need accumulated snow, which again, we've seen so much of in the last 2 weeks. You need heat to melt the snow, and then below freezing temperatures to refreeze that snow, which again, commonly forms at the eaves troughs or the overhang of a house. So a little more in-depth look at that. Now, with any home, the heat is always going to rise. So that means that the peak of the roof surface is the warmest spot of the roof. So when you have accumulated snow here, you have the interior heat that's bringing the heat up here and causing the snow to melt. From there, it's going to trickle down the slope and then catch in the overhang here. Now again, the overhang, this does not receive any heat from the interior of the home. So if it's below freezing outside, it's going to be below freezing at the eaves trough level as well. And that's why the snow can refreeze here, there, and then present as icicles or just heavy snow buildup. So again, because of the fact that it's a heat loss issue, there definitely are larger issues that are involved. If you are to knock down the icicles, that's definitely a great way to prevent any dangers from the icicles falling. However, it's not going to solve the root issue. The icicles will likely return at a later date. We find that attic inspections are actually the best way to determine the issues that are contributing to the ice damming and come up with an adequate solution. During these attic inspections, it also allows you to see if there are any additional issues going on that need to be addressed, such as leaks, condensation, or mold growth. So we're going to take a look at an attic. We have some examples here of both a normal functioning attic as well as one that's a little faulty. So any attic here, you have the soffits or the intake vents. So you have the cool air from outside coming in. They're unobstructed, able to flow through the roof and out of the output vents at the top. Any interior ventilation for kitchen or bathroom exhaust is properly connected and has a place to exit outside of the roof. Now, alternatively, in a faulty attic, some of the things that may affect the adequate airflow could be that if your interior vents are not properly connected. In that case, you have hot air from inside the home just blowing right into the attic space and making it much hotter than it should be. Another issue is that if you have insulation that's blocking your intake air, again, that's going to affect the adequate airflow. So some of the things to look for when inspecting the attic. A good first step is just to measure the space to confirm the square footage. Inside, checking for any signs of condensation and moisture. As you can see, there are suspected cases of mold in this particular picture. Any staining can also be a sign of potential leak issues. Checking that all of the systems in place, so those intake soffits and the output vents are compatible with each other and working together to promote adequate airflow. Inspecting the vent connections and the size of the openings. So as you can see here, the vent is not properly connected. So again, that's just blowing hot air out into the attic. Or we have a case here where there's actually an opening for a vent, but no vent installed. There's just shingles laid over top of it. So I'm actually going to have Duncan Campbell, my colleague, step in for a moment just to explain why the duct connections and the size of the openings is so important.
Thanks, Kelly. There are codes that determine the amount of venting required, which is input venting through your soffit and exhaust venting at the ridge of the roof. So there's calculations you do, it comes up with square footage translated to square inches. So usually we have 2 or 3 vents on a standard roof area. It's determined your floor plan size, your square footage of your floor. And for example, if someone determines you needed 3 vents on your roof to do your exhaust venting and your vents are a 12-inch opening required, well, that's 12 inch by 12 inch, that's 144 square inches per vent. If your roofer is hurrying up and just cuts quickly a vent in when they're doing the installation and cuts a 6 by 6 hole in there and puts the vent on and off he goes, well, 6 by 6 is 36 square inches. So you've got a quarter of the venting that was really determined to have, but just by somebody doing a process maybe a little too quick. So when our guys go in the attics, that's one of the things they're looking for. Is the opening adequate for the size of the vent on top of the roof? So it can make a big difference. Again, Kelly's mentioning about ducts not connected. It's not just the heat that goes into the attic, but it's the moisture that can go in that causes the condensation in your attic and additional problems in that regard. But yeah, so it is important when we go in to be looking at a lot of items, including something as simple as the size of a hole can double or triple. Having the correct hole size can double or triple your ability to exhaust your air properly, because you want air movement. That's what keeps things dry and the moisture out of there.
Thank you, Duncan. So a bit of this continued insulation is also very important in your attic space. So measuring the thickness, confirming the type of insulation, and ensuring that it is adequately distributed. As you can see here, somehow or another, the insulation has become displaced throughout, which is a problem. If it is, again, blocking the soffits and blocking that intake air, that can also be an issue. Checking for existing pipe insulation and vapor barriers is also very important, as well as the presence of baffles, which you can see in the rafters here. When we do any sort of attic inspections, we also want to be inspecting the roof surface. The main purpose there is just to confirm the vent types and sizes. Looking on the roof versus looking in the attic, you have to be looking at them both at the same time, because what you see on the roof surface isn't necessarily going to line up with what you're seeing in the attic, and vice versa. So again, an important note about attics, they are not all made the same. There are so many different types of soffit vents, of insulation, of the ridge vents. So you want to make sure that the systems that you have in place are working together. You know, changing one thing out, like your soffits, could actually affect the ventilation throughout the whole attic. Again, Duncan has a load of experience here, so he's going to share a story of a situation that he has encountered before.
Yeah, I went to a building where they had leak concerns in the upstairs of the unit. They had recently had brand new roofs put in, and the fellow had climbed into his attic and looked around, and water was coming in everywhere, so he felt his roof was failing. So I did a quick look from the ground before I got in and saw that there was a ridge vent on the building. I guess when they put the roof in, they put a nice ridge vent. But I went inside his attic, and even in the house, he has wasn't using his fans properly, so there was a lot of moisture in there. So I looked in his attic, and there was water dripping throughout the whole attic. It was black, staining, and just water everywhere. So I realized there was something not right. This to me, then I went up on the roof, looked at it, it's in good shape. So I knew there was something that I wasn't seeing or thinking about. So stood back and looked at the building, and actually what the company that had done the roof recently had done, they had taken all the venting, the upper vents that vent the attic area, they'd removed them and put a ridge vent, which is a nice system down the middle of the roof, but they hadn't gone inside to see what the situation was. And what it was is it was back-to-back units. So at the peak of the roof, one side was one unit and one the other, with a firewall down the middle. So they had taken out good venting in the attics, put in a ridge vent, which was then above a firewall. So they effectively had given them no venting, and it was probably 200 unit complex. So they had to go back to the company that did their roof and get them to take the ridge venting out and put new venting through the whole complex. And that was, you know, it was well intended when they did the ridge vent, but they never checked inside. And as Kelly had mentioned before, with looking at things on the roof, you don't always know what's happening inside. A dormer could have plywood coming down and cutting an attic off a little bit. Even though there's a vent there, it might only be venting a section of the attic and not the whole thing. That's it.
So now we're going to talk a bit about preventions and solutions for ice damming. One very important thing to note is that because not all attics are the same, there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. That's why we like to conduct these attic inspections to determine the specific issues that are occurring and causing ice damming at these specific complexes, and then determining a solution that's specific to the building. In some cases, the small changes that are made during an attic inspection scope can make the difference. In other cases, additional recommendations may be required. So we're just going to look at a couple of those. In one case, again, as Duncan was mentioning, just about the amount of vents and the size of the openings compared to the square footage of the attic and how much square footage they are venting. A solution might be to install additional output vents just to allow for more adequate airflow and ventilation. Insulation is also hugely important. So again, there's various different types of insulation for the attic. So ensuring that there is adequate insulation and a vapor barrier is going to be the best way to ensure that the heat stays inside the home. Some of the solutions here can be installing additional insulation where required, removing any saturated insulation from condensation or leak issues, and then redistributing any displaced insulation or anything that's blocking the soffits. In this particular case, we have blown-in insulation, but as you can see, it's actually blown in right to the edge of the roof and likely blocking the soffits. We do have a baffle in here that looks like it was installed when the actual house and the roof were built, which again is going to help with the ventilation and just with making sure that the soffit is not blocked in that particular location. But again, just making sure that you have adequate insulation is going to be very helpful for the overall ventilation and airflow. Heating cables. This is something that we have people ask about quite often, or that people assume that this is kind of the only solution to ice damming. Oftentimes, heating cables on their own may not eliminate the presence of ice damming, but can help out with the issue. There are some cases in particular where it may be the only option because the space does not have an attic. So that's something that you might see if there is a vaulted ceiling, and in that case, you don't have an attic space or crawl space that is accessible to investigate. With the heat trace cables, they are something where a lot more planning is involved, and it's definitely something that needs to be maintained and inspected over the years. If there are any questions that you have specifically about heat trace cables, we would be more than happy to answer those for you at any time. So some of the ways that we can help, we do have 24/7 emergency service if you do have any critical icicle buildup that you need to have removed so that it doesn't present any sort of hazard to your residents. Coming up with an attic inspection plan, again, that is specific to the issues that you're experiencing, is something that we can do as well. And then if there are any larger recommendations for mitigating the ice damming issue, those repairs are something that we would be able to carry out as well. So just to summarize, again, the presence of ice damming can indicate larger issues occurring in the home, such as leaks, mold growth, or condensation. So it is something that you want to get looked at and not just have the icicles knocked down. Because of the fact that ice damming is the result of heat loss, ensuring that the attic is properly insulated and that all systems are working together is going to be the best way to allow for adequate airflow. Any cosmetic changes to the vents or soffits, it is important to note what is happening in the attic and that the changes are specific to the systems in place. And then any steps for prevention are dependent on the particular building, and there's not a one-size-all solution. So we are going to be getting into our Q&A. Before that, Duncan, is there anything else that you would like to add before we open the floor for questions?
Just basically that ice damming, like I say, you see the icicles, but sometimes it's just a reminder that there's a bigger issue that you may not be seeing. If you have buildings that have a lot of icicles, sometimes it's like you get it through the winter and you make a note, especially if there's a complex with multiple buildings and you see a theme, that complex has them, other complexes don't, or individual units have it. Perhaps you could do, if it was something you were concerned about as a start, maybe, those units that had the concern, you could, put on a schedule to review them. But no, just the importance of looking after your attic. It's not a big job, but it's important to the life of the building. So.
Okay, so We do have a few questions in the chat, so maybe we can start with those, and then if there's any others that that come up, we can address those as well. So we do have a question here. What about roof heaters? What can you do to not have frozen downspouts?
Well, your downspouts, you can run your the heat trace cables can go down the downspouts. So you would have to work that, and sometimes it's in conjunction with a heat trace cable on the roof. You would run it. You can run it the full length of the downspout, the top of the downspout. You need a ground fault protected circuit available for that, and they're generally site specific, the size of the cable, length of the cable. One of the things to make sure is before the winter starts that your gutters and your downspouts are clear. Sometimes your downspouts may have multiple bends and you think they're clear, but there might be some debris that's gathered up there over the years if somebody hasn't cleared that out for you. But going into a winter, you should be checking to make sure that the gutters are all running clear. It's very important. So, and then, like I say, typical be heat trace cable on the inside, or you could wrap a pipe. If you have a problem area, you could have a cable on the outside of the pipe. They're very low wattage. They just, they don't get too hot, but they just keeps it warm over time, which keeps the water flowing.
So we do have a couple of questions about heat tracers, so I'm just going to jump down to some of those before we get into some of the other topics. So somebody asks, how long is a heating cable supposed to last? And we also have a question about whether or not the heat tracer is a fire hazard.
Lifespan is going to depend. There's so many brands out there. I would hate to say if you're putting them on, I would be checking it regularly. And if there's any sign of deterioration at all, do you have birds in the area? Do you have, how aggressive is the snow sliding on your roof? We don't put in a lot of them, but we do install them. We generally look at the root causes of the problem, why the snow is melting, why it's damming up on there, like from the attic and in the building side of things. But I don't know the typical number of years you'd get out of it, but after a couple of years, I would certainly be checking it and getting an electrician out to determine if it's safe enough to use. They can do resistance tests and things on some of them. So, but buying it from a proper manufacturer is important as well. And sorry, the other question on that, Kelly?
How safe is heat trace cables as a fire hazard, and how often it needs to be inspected?
Well, I would be inspecting it annually. I would make sure it's on a ground fault protected circuit, which it has to be. That's an outside wire. It has to be. Again, you know, if you buy something from a reputable distributor, and any electrical device, if not installed properly and maintained, can be a concern. It's a heating device. It's a low wattage, and the good ones are self-regulated. So.
We have, what about baffles? How do they improve ventilation?
A baffle is, and I wish I had a sample, but it's generally styrofoam, or you can build a wood baffle. But it allows, if you're insulating an attic, like the picture that Kelly had shown with the blown in insulation, with the insulation going up to the under deck of the roof. So before you put the blown in insulation, you put a baffle, which is generally styrofoam, fits between the trusses, you staple it in place, and it gives you an air channel. So that air channel will prevent the insulation from covering the overhanging soffit where the air comes into the building. So you would want to make sure you don't need it every space, but if depending on the design, you should have enough to give you your square foot allowance or your square inch allowance of air input to the building. Again, some buildings have a vent in the soffit every 5 feet. Some have a continual strip. Some have just a perforated aluminum, perforated vinyl. So it's a continual airflow. So before you put any insulation in, or if you have an existing attic and the insulation, you look in there and you can see that there's no possible way any air could get in from the underside of your soffit into the roof, then you should be getting the insulation pulled back, insert a baffle in. Just, it stops that insulation from covering that air input. The thing with an attic is you can have great ventilation on the top. You could have 10 vents on the top of your roof if it was, but that hot air is not going to go anywhere unless you have input air to replace it. As soon as you put input air, then you get a movement. And the important thing with air movement in an attic, which is what your input on your soffits and your exhaust do, is your air is moving. It keeps the attic fresh and dry. If you have a little bit of water ingress and fresh circulating air in there, it's not a big problem. But if you don't have that, that's when you get the mold and condensation and leaks that look like they're, a huge leak in the roof, but it's just the internal environment in the attic is causing you concerns.
What is the process for removing icicles?
Well, that would be more, you guys would know that. I don't, in Vancouver, I'm not as familiar with the process of removing icicles, but it would be ladder setup. We would always make the area safe. We would, ground level delineation would be one of our key things. The one thing is you don't want to damage your gutters or do any more damage by removing them. So it's going to have to be a careful process. Kelly, I don't know. It's not something that I've participated in too much myself. I apologize.
We have to, like Duncan said, we just have to remove them carefully to make sure we're not causing any damage to the gutters and making sure that the ladder safety setup is proper and knocking them down, and also making sure the ground delineation is.
Yeah, we do snow removal with snow rakes and that as well, where we'll pull the snow down with extendable rakes onto the roof. Again, those are reactive solutions to the problem. It's at the time it happens. Yeah, but most of all is the safety concern with the water on the ground, ice forming on the ground from the water dripping down, and then also.
Yeah. This week, what we saw the most dangerous that we want to address immediately is the very large icicle formations in the townhome complexes. Those are a massive liability and could possibly kill somebody if they get large enough. So if you ever see large ice formations in your complex, make sure to immediately get a qualified roofer out to remove them. Otherwise, that could be a huge liability. I think everybody probably remembers the story in downtown Toronto 2 years ago where an icicle fell from a tower and went through a postal truck's windshield right into the passenger seat.
So we do have a question about vents here. Are turbines necessary when installing edge vents?
Edge vents are just another form of input air. So a turbine vent is a good venting system. If you have a standard attic vent or a ridge vent, it'll give you the same result as long as you are meeting the requirements for your square footage. You don't have to have any particular style. Some people prefer turbine vents. It's more a matter of, a turbine vent is just the one that spins. It's got the cylindrical vanes on it. Some people like them better than other vents, but no, it doesn't really matter as long as you have the appropriate square footage and that they're in the right locations.
Okay, so is there anything else that anybody wants to ask? Feel free to unmute yourself and ask away if you have anything else.
Thank you for everybody participating. Is there any final questions? If you don't have anything you can think of and you have any feedback or questions at all, please send us an email after. We're going to be sending out a follow-up email. And then as well as if there's any topics that anybody wants to learn more about, feel free to let us know. We can always do up an educational webinar on that. Okay, perfect. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.